One early morning, just before his shift at the warehouse, Jason walked down a quiet alley, his mind heavy with worries. The work at the warehouse was grueling, but the real weight on his shoulders was Mia's illness. Every day brought more hospital bills and the fear that he might not be able to afford the treatment she needed. How much longer could he keep this up? Was there a way out? Could he save her? Suddenly, a strange sound from the end of the alley stopped him in his tracks. Two men were trying to drag a young boy into a van. The child screamed and struggled, but no one was around to help. Jason couldn't believe what he was seeing. A kidnapping, right in front of him. He had mere seconds to decide. Should he act? Could he afford to risk everything? His job, his pay, even his life? But if he didn't step in, what kind of person would he be? Could he really stand by and watch this child's life being stolen? Without a second thought, Jason charged toward the van. His heart raced as he rushed toward the child, knowing full well that this one decision could change everything. Would he save the boy, or would this moment mark the beginning of a new, uncharted path for him? Let's search for the answer together in today's story. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're tuning in from. Is it sunny or snowing where you are? If it's cold, make sure to bundle up, grab a cup of hot tea, and enjoy today's story with your loved ones. Stay healthy in the winter. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories to come. It was a cool Monday morning, the kind of day that promised a peaceful start to the week. The streets were still waking up, with only a few people braving the chill in the air. The usual hum of the city was missing, replaced by the faint sounds of distant traffic and the occasional chirp of birds. But for Jason Hale, this tranquility was fleeting. His mind was already racing ahead to the day that awaited him, and the quiet street offered no comfort as his boots hit the cracked pavement with purpose. Jason had always been a man of routine. He didn't have the luxury of wandering through the day. He had to keep moving. His job at Westline Distribution was one that didn't tolerate tardiness, and he was already running late. The small backpack he carried swayed lightly with each hurried step, a constant reminder of the responsibilities he had at home. His watch flashed 7:52 a.m. as he checked it again, the second time in as many minutes. He had to keep moving. He had already been late twice this month, and another slip-up would mean a docking of his wages. Money he simply couldn't afford to lose, especially not with his daughter Mia's medical bills mounting. Jason quickened his pace, his heartbeat picking up as his thoughts turned to Mia. The mounting pressure of her illness, the constant trips to the hospital, and the uncertain future. They weighed on him every day. But he couldn't afford to let his mind linger on these things now. He had to get to work. He had no other choice. Turning the corner of Elm Street, Jason's stride faltered for a split second. He had heard something, faint at first, like a rustling in the wind. It was almost indistinguishable from the usual sounds of the city, but then it came again, louder this time. A muffled cry, a voice filled with panic. Jason stopped in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. It was a child's voice, high-pitched and desperate. "Please, let me go." The words were sharp, filled with terror, and they sent a chill down his spine. The sound was coming from an alley just ahead, a narrow passageway between two rundown buildings. His gaze darted down the quiet street. It was early, and most people were either at work or still at home. No one would hear the cry for help if he kept walking. He couldn't just ignore it. Could he? For a moment, Jason hesitated. His job, his bills, his own mounting frustrations, they all seemed to shout at him, urging him to keep going, to turn a blind eye and ignore the sound. But the voice didn't let him. It pierced through his thoughts, sharp and frantic. "Help! Somebody, please help me." His heart raced. His gut told him that something was horribly wrong. But what could he do? He was just a man walking down a quiet street. No hero, no one special. He was already running late for work, and it wasn't his problem. But then, another cry. This time, it was louder, more urgent, and Jason's resolve crumbled. Without thinking, he took a step toward the alley. His mind was screaming at him to keep walking, but his legs moved before he could protest. The sound of his boots hitting the pavement felt distant now, as if the world around him had faded away. Jason rounded the corner into the alley, his breath quick and shallow. What he saw made his stomach drop. Two men, rough-looking and dressed in dark, mismatched clothes, were struggling with a boy, no more than 10 years old. The child was shaking, tears streaming down his face as one of the men tried to drag him into a van parked just out of sight. The boy's small fists beat uselessly against the men's arms, and he was crying out for help, his voice broken with fear. Jason didn't think. He acted. Without pausing, he charged forward, his body moving on pure adrenaline. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice harsh and loud. The two men looked up, their expressions changing instantly from surprise to hostility. One of them reached for something at his waist, a glint of metal catching the weak morning light. Jason didn't give him a chance. He barreled into the closest man, knocking him off balance and sending him crashing into a dumpster. The second man lunged at Jason, but Jason was quicker. He dodged the blow, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it behind his back with a grunt of effort. The man hissed in pain but tried to break free. But Jason wasn't letting go. Not this time. His hands tightened, his heart thudding in his chest as he shouted at the boy to run. The boy didn't hesitate. He scrambled to his feet, running toward the street without looking back. The two criminals, now clearly stunned by the unexpected confrontation, began to retreat. Jason, breathing heavily, stood in the alley, fists clenched, watching them disappear into the shadows. He had stopped them, stopped something terrible from happening, but at what cost? As he watched the boy run into the safety of the street, Jason's pulse slowed. He had acted on instinct, without thinking. He wasn't sure whether to feel proud or terrified. The truth was, he had risked everything in that moment. His job, his safety, his life, and he didn't even know why. But as the adrenaline began to ebb, he realized something. He had just made a choice. And that choice, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had changed him forever. Jason's heart was still pounding when he pushed open the door to Westline Distribution. The ding of the overhead bell barely registered as he stepped into the busy warehouse, his eyes immediately darting to the clock on the wall. 8:08 a.m. He was already 10 minutes late, and he knew it wouldn't go unnoticed. As he made his way across the concrete floor, the low hum of machines and the chatter of the morning shift faded into the background. He wasn't looking forward to what came next. His boss, Leonard Rolland, didn't tolerate tardiness, not for anyone. Not even for a momentary act of heroism. Jason's mind flashed back to the alley, to the boy's terrified face, but it didn't matter now. He had done what he had to do. He had made the right choice, but it wasn't enough to offset the reality of his work life. This job, this place, demanded punctuality, and he was about to pay the price. "Hail!" Roland's voice barked across the warehouse, snapping Jason out of his thoughts. Jason stopped in his tracks, his stomach twisting into a knot. He turned slowly, already knowing what was coming. Leonard Rolland, a tall, burly man with a permanent frown etched on his face, was standing near the break room, arms crossed over his chest. His face was as hard as stone, and his eyes bored into Jason with disapproval. "You're late again," Rolland said, his voice low but firm, carrying the weight of frustration. Jason swallowed hard. "I know. I'm sorry. I don't want to hear it," Rolland cut him off, taking a few steps toward him. "We've got a schedule to stick to here. A schedule that doesn't wait for anybody. You think those pallets are going to load themselves?" He gestured toward the stack of boxes waiting to be moved. "Do you think I can just ignore your tardiness because you were out playing hero?" Jason felt his chest tighten. He had known this would happen. He'd known it the second he stepped into the building. Rolland didn't care about the circumstances. He didn't care about the boy he had saved. All that mattered was that Jason had shown up late. "I didn't have a choice, Leonard," Jason said, his voice more forceful than he had intended. "There was a kid. I had to help. He was in danger." Roland's eyes narrowed, and a cynical laugh escaped him. "You think I care about your little rescue mission?" He shook his head, scoffing. "This is a business, Hale. Not some superhero movie. We don't have time for you to play the Good Samaritan. You're here to work." Jason opened his mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. What could he say? How could he explain that, in that moment, the right thing to do wasn't to keep walking but to save a child's life? How could he make Rolland understand that the boy's life had mattered more than a few minutes of lost time? But none of that seemed to matter now. What mattered was that he was late. He couldn't afford to lose this job, especially with Mia's medical bills weighing him down. He had already been warned once this month about his tardiness. One more slip-up, and he'd find himself looking for a new job, and that was a luxury he couldn't afford. "I'm sorry," Jason finally said, his voice tight with frustration. "It won't happen again." Roland's expression softened, but only slightly. "You're damn right it won't. You're already an hour behind. You've got shipments going out by noon. Get to work. Hale." Jason nodded, the bitterness in his mouth still lingering, but he said nothing. He turned and walked toward the loading dock, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The tension in the air felt thick, suffocating, as if everything he did would be scrutinized. As if nothing he did, no matter how right or brave, would ever be enough to make up for the simple fact that he wasn't allowed to make mistakes. The reality of his life, the struggle to balance his job, his daughter's needs, and his own moral compass, felt like a weight he was carrying alone. There was no one to share it with, no one to understand the kind of choices he was forced to make every single day. Not Rolland, not anyone here. Jason grabbed a pair of gloves from his pocket and slipped them on, the rough fabric doing little to ease the tension building in his chest. The noise of the warehouse surrounded him, forklifts zipping by, workers shouting orders. But in that moment, it all felt distant, like he was watching it from far away. The only thing that mattered now was the task at hand. It was the only thing he could focus on. But deep down, Jason knew this wasn't just about the job. It was about the choices he was making, the path he was walking. And whether he liked it or not, today would mark the beginning of a new chapter in his life. A chapter he hadn't yet fully understood. The sun had barely begun to fade when Jason returned home, but the dim light in his apartment made the shadows feel heavier than usual. He closed the door behind him, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the day settled on him. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting an eerie glow across the small living room. But it was the sound of quiet breathing that caught his attention, the rhythmic rise and fall that meant Mia was asleep in her room. He walked toward her bedroom, his heart heavy with a mixture of exhaustion and guilt. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and there she was, his little girl, lying under a thick quilt, her small frame barely rising with each breath. Mia's face was peaceful, but Jason knew that underneath that calm exterior, her body was fighting a battle that was bigger than anything either of them could control. "Mia?" He whispered softly, though he knew she couldn't hear him. Her chest barely rose. The tubes and wires hooked up to her pale skin were an uncomfortable reminder of their grim reality. Jason's chest tightened as he leaned over the side of the bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "I promised you, didn't I?" he muttered to himself. He could still hear her voice from earlier in the week. "Daddy, can we go to the park tomorrow? The swings, the ice cream. Everything like we used to." He smiled faintly at the memory. That was Mia's way. Always hopeful, always holding on to the simple joys even when things seemed dark. Jason had tried to keep his promise that day and had given her a small taste of normalcy. But as much as she wanted to believe, Jason knew that the truth was much harder to face. Mia's condition wasn't getting better. The doctors had warned him months ago that they were running out of options. They had tried everything they could to stabilize her, but the treatments were no longer as effective. The bills piled up, and every phone call, every letter in the mail was a reminder of how close they were to losing everything. Jason walked over to the worn-out couch, his eyes glancing at the stack of overdue medical bills that lay on the coffee table. He had been ignoring them, hoping that maybe, just maybe, something would change, something would shift, and Mia would be okay. But with every passing day, that hope seemed to grow more distant. The truth was, he didn't know how much longer he could keep this up. The constant juggling of work and caregiving had drained him. His boss's words earlier still echoed in his mind. "You think you can just keep showing up late for your little superhero side quests?" Jason ran a hand over his face, his fingers brushing against the stubble that had been growing for days. He couldn't help it. He was tired. Tired of pretending everything would be fine. Tired of the endless cycle of bills, treatments, and uncertainty. But there was one thing that kept him going. One thing that made him get out of bed every day despite it all. Mia. His daughter's laughter still rang in his ears, a memory he clung to whenever things seemed to darken. He could remember her face when he'd promised her that they would go to the park. A small moment of happiness in a world that had become too heavy. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Don't worry, Mia," he said quietly, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. "We're going to make it through this. I'm going to find a way." It was an empty promise, he knew that. But it was all he had left to give. Jason's phone buzzed on the coffee table, dragging him from his thoughts. He glanced at it, but didn't pick it up. He already knew who it was, a reminder from the hospital about an upcoming appointment for Mia. Another date he would have to mark on the calendar, another bill he would have to figure out how to pay. The reality of it all seemed like a mountain he was too tired to climb, but there was no other choice. He had to keep moving. For Mia. Sighing, he stood up, rubbing his neck as he walked back to her bedside. The soft hum of the machines was a constant reminder of the fragility of their situation, but it also brought him comfort. It meant she was still here. "Daddy's right here," Jason whispered, brushing his thumb gently over Mia's hand. "I'm not going anywhere." The promise felt like a lie, but it was one he would keep. As long as Mia needed him, he would fight for her, even if it meant sacrificing his own peace of mind. Jason stood there for a moment longer, watching her sleep, his heart aching with the knowledge that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried, it might not be enough. But he would keep trying, because that's what fathers did. The first light of morning poured through the cracked blinds, spilling golden beams across the modest living room. Jason sat in the worn armchair, the fabric creased and frayed from years of use. He had made a habit of waking early, before the world outside got too noisy, before the weight of the day came crashing in. It was his moment of peace, though he knew it wouldn't last long. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, but for now, it seemed like time had slowed. Mia, still tucked under her thick blanket, stirred lightly in her bed across the room. Her small figure was a comforting sight in the otherwise quiet apartment. The pale sunlight lit up her face, casting a soft glow over the features that were so familiar, so full of life. Her hair was tangled in messy curls, and for a moment, Jason simply watched her, lost in the calm of the morning. He had learned long ago to savor these moments with her. These quiet mornings, where nothing seemed urgent, where the world outside was distant and unimportant. He wanted to hold on to them as tightly as he could, even though the reality of their situation was always lurking at the edge of his mind. He heard her soft voice break the stillness. "Daddy," she murmured, her eyes fluttering open. Jason smiled, standing up from his chair and walking over to her bed. "Hey, Peanut," he said, his voice gentle. He sat down on the edge of the mattress, brushing a few strands of hair from her forehead. "Did you sleep well?" She nodded, her smile soft but tired. "I had a dream. We went to the park. You promised." Jason's heart tightened. He had promised her so many things, and every day, it seemed harder to keep those promises. But he couldn't break this one. Not today. "We'll go soon, Mia. I swear. Just a little longer, okay?" Her smile grew wider, and her small hand reached out to grasp his. "Okay, Daddy. I love you." Jason squeezed her hand gently. "I love you too, Mia. You're my world." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a gesture of love he had given her since she was a baby. No matter how tough life got, no matter how many hurdles he faced, Jason promised himself that he would always be there for her. The bills, the hospital visits, the stress, it could all wait for a moment. He needed to be her rock. But deep down, Jason knew the weight of their situation was unbearable. Every time he looked at the mounting pile of medical bills on the kitchen counter, it felt like a weight around his neck. The last few months had drained their savings, and now the money was running out. The payments had become impossible to keep up with, and he was already behind. He had no idea how long he could keep up this charade of normalcy for Mia. After a few moments, Jason reluctantly stood up and stretched his arms, his mind already turning to the inevitable tasks of the day. He had to get to work, and even though his job at Westline was paying the bills, barely, there was no guarantee that he could hold on to it much longer. The hours were long, the work was hard, and the stress was constant. But for Mia's sake, he pushed those thoughts aside. He had to make it work, somehow. He couldn't afford to fail her. "Get some more sleep, sweetheart," he said, trying to push away the worry creeping into his chest. "Let me go get breakfast ready." As he walked toward the kitchen, Jason caught sight of the bills again. Stacked neatly on the table, they felt like a mountain he couldn't climb. His mind raced through the numbers, calculating the shortfall, wondering if there was any way he could get ahead. But the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. The debt from Mia's treatments, the rent, the utilities, all of it weighed on him, pressing down on his chest like a physical burden. Jason stood still for a moment, staring at the bills on the counter. It was all too much. The quiet of the morning was abruptly shattered when Jason noticed the sleek black SUV parked across the street. At first, he thought it was nothing, a random car passing through, maybe someone visiting a neighbor. But the vehicle's dark windows and its eerie stillness seemed too deliberate, too out of place for the sleepy neighborhood. Jason's breath caught in his throat as he stood by the window, watching the vehicle from the shadowed corner of the living room. The more he looked at it, the more he felt a sickening sense of dread coil in his stomach. The street was empty otherwise, the silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. His heart began to race, a low hum of anxiety pulsing through his veins. What were they doing here? Why had they come? His mind raced back to the events of the previous week. The men in the alley, the attempt to grab Timothy, the desperate cries of the boy. He had thought he was done with them. But the nagging fear in the pit of his stomach told him that wasn't true. He hadn't escaped them at all. He had only delayed the inevitable. The SUV was still there, parked with ominous stillness. Jason's pulse quickened. He couldn't ignore it now. He had to make sure they weren't watching him. The thought of the kidnappers coming after him, the same men who had tried to snatch Timothy, sent a jolt of fear through his body. He glanced over his shoulder at Mia, still curled up in bed, unaware of the storm brewing just outside their door. The last thing he wanted was to keep her from having to face danger, to whatever these men might want. But he couldn't simply hide, not with the growing suspicion gnawing at him. He had to be prepared. If the kidnappers were here to settle a score, if they were looking for him, Jason wasn't about to wait around to find out. Taking a deep breath, he moved silently toward the kitchen, his fingers brushing the edge of the counter as his mind raced. What should he do? He needed a weapon. His eyes landed on the old baseball bat in the corner of the room. It wasn't much, but it was something. A means of defense, a way to protect Mia if things went sideways. His hands shook as he grabbed the bat, the cold metal of it sending a chill through his body. The thud of his heart matched the rhythm of his footsteps as he moved back toward the front door. He paused, standing still for a moment as his breath fogged in the cool air. The knock came again, sharp and insistent. Jason froze. The sound of the knock felt like an explosion, an unrelenting demand that shattered the stillness of the morning. He stared at the door, every muscle in his body tensed, his mind grappling with the possibilities of what was on the other side. Was it the men? Could they have followed him here? Maybe they were looking for revenge, for something he had done, something he hadn't even realized was a mistake. Jason pressed his ear against the door, straining to hear anything that could give him a clue. Silence. Then another knock, this time louder, more urgent. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the adrenaline surging through his veins. He wanted to open the door, to confront whatever was on the other side, but he couldn't bring himself to move. What if they had come for Mia? What if they had somehow found out who she was, found out that she was his weakness? His thoughts spun in a dizzying spiral. He knew he couldn't ignore it. He couldn't let fear control him. But there was a part of him, deep inside, that feared what would happen if he opened that door. What if this was it? What if this was the end of the quiet life he had fought so hard to maintain? Another knock. This time, the sound seemed to echo through the small apartment, reverberating against the walls, the windows, the very foundation. Jason's grip tightened around the baseball bat. He couldn't avoid this confrontation forever. But he wasn't ready. Not yet. With a trembling hand, he reached for the door handle, hesitating for just a moment. His heart hammered in his chest. What would he find on the other side? A face he recognized? A stranger? The kidnappers? Or someone else? Someone who knew far too much about him? He could feel the sweat gathering on his palms, his breath shallow as he stood there. The door was heavy, like it was a barrier between him and whatever storm was about to hit. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to open it. Not yet. The knock came again. Louder. More forceful. Jason exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He knew that whatever waited on the other side of that door would change everything. And with one last breath, he steadied himself, staring at the door, preparing for whatever was to come. Jason's mind raced with possibilities. They might be here for retribution, seeking to punish him for getting involved. Or worse, maybe they had seen him take Timothy to the police station, and now they were coming to finish what they started. He had no idea what they could want, but every instinct told him they were dangerous. He grabbed the wooden bat from the corner of the room, its weight familiar in his hands. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. His fingers tightened around the handle as his eyes flicked between the door and the window. He couldn't just stand there. He had to confront this, whatever it was, head on. The tension in the room seemed to build with every passing second. Jason's breath was shallow, his grip on the bat growing tighter as he heard the faint sound of footsteps approaching the door. It was just a soft tap, almost tentative at first, but it made Jason's heart skip a beat. His pulse hammered in his ears as he stood frozen, his mind on high alert. The knock came again, stronger this time. A rapid series of knocks that sent a jolt of panic through his chest. His legs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, and for a moment, he just stood there, unable to move. Was it them? He could feel the cold sweat on his brow as he glanced back at Mia's room. She was still asleep, her chest rising and falling with every breath. He couldn't let her wake up to this. Whatever was happening, he had to keep her safe. He had to stay in control. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of someone calling out, "Hello? Is anyone home?" Jason's throat went dry. The voice was unfamiliar, but it was hard to make out the tone. There was no mistaking the unease in his chest, though. Whoever it was, they weren't here to just say hello. His mind jumped to conclusions. What if it was a trap? What if they had brought someone else with them? He slowly approached the door, every muscle in his body tense, ready for whatever might come next. His hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure whether to open it or stay hidden. Every instinct screamed at him to wait, to stay still, to be careful. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew more insistent, more urgent. Whoever was on the other side wasn't going to leave. Jason gritted his teeth. He couldn't let this continue. His grip on the bat tightened as he took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever confrontation lay beyond the door. The sound of footsteps faded for a moment, and Jason thought he had a brief moment of peace, but his relief was short-lived. The figure outside was no longer waiting. He could hear them shifting from one foot to the other, pacing. Jason's heart began to race faster, his mind spinning through every worst-case scenario. Finally, the voice called out again, louder this time, a bit more forceful. "I know you're in there. Open up." Jason hesitated for just a moment longer, staring at the door as if it might open on its own. The decision weighed heavily on him. He couldn't just let them in, but he couldn't run either. He had to know what they wanted. Taking a deep breath, Jason slowly reached for the knob, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. He steeled himself, bracing for whatever was about to come. But just before he turned the handle, there was a sound from behind him, a soft rustling, the faintest noise that made his spine stiffen. Mia had stirred. She was awake. "Daddy!" Her small voice echoed from the bedroom. Jason's heart skipped. The timing couldn't be worse. He turned toward her, his mind racing even faster now. He had to protect her, no matter what. With one final glance at the door, Jason made his decision. He wasn't going to open it. Not yet. He would wait, but he was ready. Ready for whatever would come next. And as he stood there, staring at the door, the uncertainty and fear that had been building all morning reached a boiling point. The knock came again. Jason stood in the shadows of his small house, his hand gripping the doorknob tightly, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the engine of the large SUV come to a halt right outside his door. The headlights illuminated the window, casting long shadows and making the room feel even darker and colder. The tension in the air grew unbearable, and a flood of questions began racing through his mind. Who was standing behind that door? Taking a deep breath, Jason slowly turned the knob and opened the door, his pulse racing. Standing before him was a stranger, disheveled hair and a piercing gaze. The man stood tall and composed, his face calm yet exuding an air of authority. His black suit reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. Jason was still tense, but it had lessened, just a little. "Good evening," the man said, his voice deep, yet commanding. "I'm Daniel Hayes, assistant to the CEO of Apex Global Solutions." He paused for a moment, then added, "The child you helped save a few days ago is my nephew." Jason froze. His eyes widened in shock. The fear that had gripped him moments before seemed to melt away, replaced by an unexpected ripple of realization. Suddenly, everything clicked. He stared at the man, speechless. "I'm sorry if I startled you," Daniel continued, sensing Jason's confusion. "But I wanted to thank you. You've done something important." Jason swallowed, still trying to process the information. The adrenaline that had been pumping through his veins began to slow, but the nervousness didn't completely fade. I didn't think it was anything special," he replied, his voice hoarse. "I just did what anyone would have done." Daniel gave a slight nod, his gaze softening a little. "I understand, but not everyone would have done what you did. You saved him, and that means a lot to my family." He paused again, then, almost as if he had been rehearsing, added, "I wanted to talk to you about something else." Jason's stomach twisted. He felt that old, familiar weight of uncertainty press down on him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his expression turning more serious. "I work for a company, Apex Global Solutions. It's a logistics company, one of the best in the industry. We're expanding, and we're looking for someone with your skills. Someone who's resourceful. You handled that situation with the kid well. You've got potential." Jason blinked. The words seemed surreal, like they didn't belong in the same sentence as his life. "I don't understand," he said, his mind racing. "You want me to work for your company?" "Yes," Daniel said, his tone steady. "We're offering you a position in our logistics department. We've seen something in you. You have the ability to learn, to think on your feet. I know this is a lot to take in, but you're exactly the kind of person we're looking for." Jason's head was spinning. The thought of leaving his old life behind, of stepping into a world he barely understood, felt overwhelming. He had spent so long just scraping by, working from one dead-end job to the next, just trying to survive. The idea of changing all that, it felt like a gamble. "But I don't know anything about logistics or computers," Jason admitted, his voice tinged with self-doubt. "I'm just a warehouse guy. I don't have any special skills." Daniel's expression softened. "You'd be surprised how much potential you have. This would be a learning process. It's not about what you know right now, but about what you're willing to learn. We'll teach you. We'll give you the support you need." Jason felt a mix of emotions: fear, excitement, confusion. His mind flashed to Mia, her hospital bills, the constant worry about her health. This job could be the break he needed, but it was also a huge risk. What if he couldn't handle it? What if he failed? Daniel seemed to read his thoughts. "I know it's a lot to think about, but you're not alone in this. You'll have guidance. And besides, you're doing this for yourself, for your family." Jason looked down, his gaze falling to the floor as his mind raced. His thoughts flickered to Mia, to the life he had promised her. He had to do something. He had to make it work. After a long pause, Jason finally looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice steady but uncertain. "I'll give it a try. I'll take the job." Daniel smiled, a small, reassuring smile. "Good. You won't regret it, Jason. I'll have someone contact you tomorrow to go over the details." As Daniel turned to leave, Jason stood frozen at the door, feeling the weight of the decision settle over him. For the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. It was a step into the unknown, but it was also a step toward something better. And maybe, just maybe, It was the change he needed for himself and for Mia. The first day at Apex Global Solutions felt surreal. Jason stood in front of the building, staring up at the tall glass structure that gleamed in the morning sunlight. It felt like a different world from the warehouse, where the heavy smell of oil and cardboard had always been inescapable. Here, the air was different, cleaner, fresher, and filled with the sound of quiet efficiency. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt the weight of his burdens lighten just a little. This place, this new beginning, it was what he had been desperately clinging to. A chance at something better. For Mia, for himself, for a future that didn't feel like an endless string of dead ends. As he entered the building, the hum of activity was immediately apparent. People were moving quickly, talking in low voices, exchanging information, but there was an underlying sense of order to it all. Jason's shoes clicked against the polished floors, his footsteps in rhythm with the pulse of the company's operations. He was assigned to a training session, a walkthrough of the different departments, and an introduction to his new responsibilities. It felt overwhelming. The technology, the pace, the jargon. It was all so different from the grueling, mind-numbing routine of the warehouse. But there was something invigorating about it. For the first time in a long while, Jason felt challenged in a way that wasn't dictated by survival. The work was demanding, but it was the kind of challenge he welcomed. It was the kind of challenge that promised something more than just another paycheck. His new supervisor, Sophia, was sharp and approachable, a woman in her mid-30s who seemed to have a natural command over the team. She gave him a quick overview of his responsibilities for the day, her smile warm but professional. "Jason, right? We'll start with the logistics floor," Sophia said, leading him through the bustling office. "Don't worry, you'll get the hang of it. You're here because you've got potential, so just stay sharp, and we'll take it from there." Jason nodded, though he could feel the pressure building in his chest. He wasn't used to this level of attention or expectation. Back at the warehouse, he had been just another worker. Here, it felt different. He had to prove himself, and there was no room for failure. As they walked through the floor, Jason couldn't help but marvel at the precision of the operation. Everything moved seamlessly, like clockwork. There were computers tracking inventory, teams coordinating shipments, and people collaborating in a way that felt organized and purposeful. Jason stood at the edge of the operations floor, taking in the buzzing activity around him. The sound of keyboards clacking, phones ringing, and the low hum of machines working in unison filled the air. He had barely been there for an hour, but already, it felt like he had stepped into a different world. The frantic, chaotic pace of the warehouse was behind him, replaced by a level of organization that he hadn't known existed. People moved efficiently, each one knowing exactly what they were doing, where they were headed, and why. But for Jason, it was all a blur. Sophia had walked him through the basics: how to process inventory, how to track shipments, how to coordinate with other departments. But the instructions were a maze of acronyms and terminology he was struggling to understand. His head was spinning as he tried to absorb it all. His fingers hovered awkwardly over the keyboard, unsure of the shortcuts Sophia had rattled off just moments ago. He didn't belong here. That thought had been nagging him since the moment he stepped into the building. The walls felt taller, the desks seemed cleaner, the people seemed smarter. He felt small, like a fish out of water, trying to keep up with the school of professionals around him. Jason fumbled with a shipping manifest, trying to make sense of the columns of numbers and dates. His eyes kept flicking back to the screen, hoping it would suddenly reveal its secrets. He was halfway through sorting the first shipment when Sophia appeared at his shoulder, her presence calm and steady. "You're doing fine, Jason," she said with a reassuring smile. "You're catching on faster than most." Jason gave her a tight smile, but inside, his anxiety continued to churn. He appreciated her encouragement, but the doubt gnawing at him wouldn't subside. He had been in a world of physical labor for so long that this new environment, this new world, felt alien. He wasn't used to sitting still, thinking things through, or working with computers. What if he wasn't cut out for this? What if he wasn't smart enough to make it? He had to push those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to fail, not now. "I'm just trying to keep up," he said with a shrug, his voice betraying the unease he felt. "I've never worked in anything like this before." I'm just trying to learn the ropes. Sophia nodded, her eyes scanning his work. It's a learning curve for sure, but you're doing well. Just take it one step at a time. Jason gave a half-hearted nod, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about Mia. Every time he made a mistake, every time something didn't click, he worried about what that meant for their future. Was he doing enough? Was this the right move for her? The pressure weighed heavily on him, but he couldn't show it. He had to prove himself. He had to be better. For Mia, after a few more hours of orientation, Sophia handed him a new task, a project involving shipping and tracking an international order. Jason's stomach tightened. This was more responsibility than he had expected, and while part of him wanted to feel excited, the other part, the part that had spent years struggling in dead-end jobs, felt a wave of fear. What if he messed this up? He sat down at his desk, fingers hovering over the keyboard, and took a deep breath. The screen in front of him seemed to mock him with its complexity, but he couldn't back down now. Not after everything he'd been through to get here. He'd come too far to quit now. I can do this, he muttered to himself, his hands slowly starting to type. Minutes turned into hours, and as the day drew to a close, Jason found himself exhausted but surprisingly proud. The work hadn't been easy, and he still felt like a fish out of water, but he had made it through. His first day was over, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a start. He had taken a step towards something better, towards something more secure. When he finally clocked out, the familiar weight of his responsibilities returned. The worries about bills, about Mia's treatment, about the future, they hadn't gone anywhere. But now, at least, there was a small glimmer of hope. As Jason walked out of the building and into the cool evening air, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. The faintest sense of possibility. Tomorrow would be another challenge, but for the first time in what felt like years, he felt like he might just be able to face it. One step at a time. The hum of the operations floor at Parker Global was beginning to feel familiar to Jason. As the days passed, the overwhelming complexity of the job slowly gave way to routine. The machines, the spreadsheets, the schedules, they were all beginning to make sense in their own way. But today was different. Today, Sophia was going to show him more. He stood at his desk, pretending to look busy while glancing at the clock. It was still early, but he could feel the weight of the day bearing down on him. He had already made mistakes, small ones, but mistakes nonetheless. He couldn't afford more. Sophia had been kind, patient even, but Jason knew it was only a matter of time before his inability to keep up would show. Just then, Sophia approached, her steps purposeful but unhurried. "Jason," she called, her tone light but firm. "You're coming with me today. Time for a deeper dive." Jason blinked, startled, before quickly nodding. "Sure," he said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. He had no idea what she had in mind, but the idea of leaving his desk was almost a relief. Maybe a change of scenery would help. Sophia led him across the floor, through rows of organized workstations, and into a more private area toward the back. The atmosphere here was quieter, the walls lined with monitors showing real-time tracking of shipments, inventory, and deliveries. It felt like the heart of the operation. "Take a seat," Sophia said, gesturing to a chair next to her at one of the desks. "You're going to shadow me for the next few hours. Let's see how you handle the big picture." Jason sat down, his nerves a bundle of wires. The screens in front of them flickered with numbers and graphs, tracking incoming shipments and warehouse inventory. Sophia began explaining the logistics behind each process, how they coordinated between departments, how the supply chain functioned from start to finish. As she spoke, Jason began to realize something. She wasn't just showing him how to do the work. She was showing him why it mattered. "You've got a good eye, Jason," Sophia said after a while, noticing him taking careful notes. "You're quick to see where things could go wrong. That's the mark of someone who pays attention." Jason was stunned. He had been so focused on his own shortcomings, on trying to catch up, that he hadn't realized he was actually starting to understand the bigger picture. He had been so used to the day-to-day grind of survival that he never took a moment to think about the systems in place, how things moved in harmony, the way everything was connected. Thanks, he stammered. "I'm still trying to get the hang of it all. There's so much to learn." Sophia smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling. Of course there is. But you've got a solid foundation. The hard part is already in you. You just need to trust it. She paused, glancing at the screen before turning back to him. This job isn't just about learning how to process shipments, Jason. It's about seeing the bigger picture, understanding what moves things forward. Jason nodded slowly, her words sinking in. I'll get there, he said, though part of him wasn't sure. But something about her certainty made him believe it too. Over the next few hours, Sophia guided him through various tasks, checking his work, pointing out the small details he had missed earlier. But instead of correcting him with frustration, she patiently explained the why behind each correction. It wasn't about just fixing mistakes. It was about understanding the process so deeply that the mistakes wouldn't happen again. By the end of the day, Jason felt like a different person. He was still far from perfect, still struggling in many areas, but the doubt that had clouded his mind all morning had begun to lift. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he might actually have a place in this world, a place where he could grow and not just survive. As the clock ticked toward the end of the workday, Sophia glanced over at him, her expression thoughtful. You're doing great, Jason. Keep pushing yourself. I can see you've got something in you, a drive. Don't lose that. Jason looked at her, a small, grateful smile tugging at his lips. Thanks, Sophia, he said quietly. I really appreciate it. She nodded. It's only the beginning, but it's a good start. Sophia began explaining the flow of the company's logistics systems, how each department was interconnected, how orders were processed, how shipments were scheduled and tracked in real time. Jason listened intently, trying to absorb the details, but it was clear that much of the terminology was still over his head. You're going to learn this, Sophia said, her voice confident yet encouraging. You're not just here to push boxes, Jason. You're here to understand how all these pieces fit together. Jason nodded, unsure whether he believed it. He had spent so much time just trying to get by in the warehouse, doing whatever it took to keep his head above water. Now, in this more structured environment, he felt the weight of expectations, his own, and those he believed others had for him. But Sophia's presence was reassuring. She had a way of breaking down complex processes into manageable pieces, making them feel less intimidating. As she walked him through various scenarios on the computer screen, she gave him clear, actionable steps. See here, she said, pointing to a chart on the screen. These are our weekly shipment forecasts. Every single one of these numbers represents a promise we've made to a customer. If we don't deliver, we risk losing the account. Jason squinted at the chart, trying to follow along. So it's not just about moving products, he said, a hint of realization creeping into his voice. It's about relationships, about keeping promises. Sophia's eyes softened, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Exactly. You're not just moving things from point A to point B. You're managing expectations, building trust. Every mistake, every delay, it all has consequences. Jason absorbed her words, the significance of her message settling in. He had never thought about logistics in such a personal way before. It wasn't just about the job, it was about the people relying on the job being done right. As the morning wore on, Sophia continued to guide him through the intricacies of the role. Every time Jason stumbled, she offered a gentle correction, a tip, or a piece of advice. She never made him feel stupid or inadequate. If anything, she made him feel capable, even when he felt like a fish out of water. You're getting the hang of this faster than most, she said at one point, giving him a thoughtful look. There's something in you, Jason. A focus, a drive. I can see it. It's more than just knowing how to track shipments. It's about finding solutions, even when things don't go according to plan. Her words hit him harder than he expected. For so long, he had been simply trying to survive, to keep his head down, to make it through the day without falling apart. But here, with Sophia's guidance, he saw a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider: growth, change, a future where he didn't just get by but thrived. Jason felt a flicker of hope, small, but there. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time in what felt like ages, he could see a path forward. And he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. As the day came to a close, Sophia led him back to the main floor. You did well today, Jason, she said, her tone warm with approval. Don't let the learning curve intimidate you. Keep asking questions. Keep pushing yourself. Jason nodded, grateful for the encouragement, even as doubts lingered in the back of his mind. But he knew one thing for sure. He was ready to take the next step. The future was still uncertain, but now, at least, it felt like something he could shape. As he left the building that evening, his heart was lighter than it had been in months. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning, growing, and most importantly, he was starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could create a better life for Mia, for himself. By the end of his first week at Parker Global, Jason felt like a different person. The frantic pace of the logistics floor had become less intimidating, and the technology, once a maze of incomprehensible numbers and systems, now seemed almost intuitive. He no longer felt like an outsider in a world that moved too fast. He had caught up, but it hadn't been easy. There were mornings when he felt like giving up. The stress of learning new systems, understanding all the intricate details of supply chains, and dealing with the rising pressures of his personal life weighed heavily on him. Some days, his mind wandered back to the familiar, albeit grueling, routine of the warehouse, where the job was tough but predictable. Here, at Parker Global, there were no simple answers, no set rhythm to follow. Every day brought new challenges. Yet, Jason pushed forward. The long hours of studying the logistics software, the countless questions he'd asked Sophia, the constant sense of being out of his depth, they were starting to pay off. And despite the obstacles, he felt something stirring inside him, a flicker of pride he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe he was more capable than he had ever given himself credit for. Maybe, just maybe, he had what it took to succeed. As he sat at his desk late on Friday afternoon, Jason glanced around the office. The usual buzz of activity was winding down, and most of his coworkers were finishing up for the day. He could hear the distant sound of voices and laughter coming from the break room. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders easing. A few weeks ago, the thought of being in this place had been overwhelming. He had been convinced he didn't belong. But now, as he typed in his final report for the day, he realized something. The work wasn't just about earning a paycheck. It was about proving something to himself. For the first time in a long while, he was doing something that mattered. Not just for himself, but for Mia, too. Jason's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Sophia. "Great work this week, Jason. Keep it up. I'm seeing real progress." A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He quickly typed back, "Thanks, Sophia. Appreciate the support." Sophia had been more than just a boss. She had been a mentor, showing him how to navigate the complexities of the job while believing in his potential, even when he hadn't believed in himself. Her encouragement had been the spark he needed. Jason looked at the clock. It was almost time to go home. He grabbed his jacket and stood up from his desk, stretching his arms above his head. The weight of the week still lingered, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he was walking on solid ground. The future, once a foggy, uncertain place, was beginning to take shape. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he had a sense of direction, and that, more than anything, felt like a victory. As he walked out the door of the office, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Mia. "Daddy, can we go to the park tomorrow?" Jason's heart warmed as he typed back quickly. "You bet. I'll pick you up after work. We'll make it a special day, just the two of us." For the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his responsibilities not as a burden, but as a source of strength. He was doing this, for Mia, for their future. And in that moment, Jason knew that no matter how hard the road ahead might be, he had the resilience to face it. He was ready for whatever came next. As Jason stood by the window of his small apartment, the soft evening light spilling through the curtains, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. A month ago, the idea of leaving the warehouse, of stepping into the world of logistics and tech, had seemed like an impossible leap. But now, he was here. He had made it. The warehouse, with its dim lighting and relentless grind, felt like a distant memory. Here, at Parker Global, Jason was beginning to see the bigger picture. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It was the key to a new future. And for the first time in years, he was starting to believe that future could be brighter, not just for him, but for Mia too. It wasn't an easy road. The challenges were still there. The mounting bills, the ever-present worry about Mia's health, but had something now that he hadn't had before. Hope. The kind of hope that came from knowing he was capable of more than just surviving. He had the tools, the drive, and, most importantly, the belief that things could change. As if on cue, Sophia appeared at his desk, a rare moment of quiet amid the usual bustle. She was holding a clipboard, reviewing some reports, but she took a moment to glance at Jason. "You've been killing it this week," Sophia said, her tone genuine. "I've been watching how you handle the shipments, the way you troubleshoot issues. You've got a knack for problem-solving that's impressive. Not many people could adapt as quickly as you have." Jason blinked, surprised. He wasn't used to this kind of praise. He had always been the one trying to keep his head down, doing his job and hoping for the best. To hear Sophia, someone he admired, someone who had shown him the ropes, acknowledge his growth hit him harder than he expected. "Thanks, Sophia," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time, he didn't just feel like he was lucky to be here. He felt like he deserved to be. Sophia gave him a knowing smile. "You've earned it. Just don't forget what you've learned here. This is just the beginning." Jason's heart swelled with pride as he looked at the task ahead. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in his life, he wasn't scared of the unknown. He could see the path unfolding before him, a path that led to something greater than mere survival. As he prepared to leave work that evening, the weight of his responsibilities no longer felt like a burden. He had a renewed sense of purpose. The uncertainty of the future had turned into a challenge he was ready to meet head-on. Jason knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be more struggles, more difficult decisions, and more nights spent awake wondering how he could make it all work. But now, he had a vision. He wasn't just doing this for the bills or for survival. He was doing it for Mia. He was doing it to give her the life she deserved, to give both of them a future that wasn't filled with fear. As Jason walked out of the office, he looked up at the sky, a new sense of determination filling him. For the first time in a long while, he believed that the glimmer of hope he had seen in the distance was something real. It wasn't just a fleeting thought. It was a future, his future. And so, Jason's journey continues, one step at a time. The road ahead may be long, but with resilience, determination, and the right support, anything is possible. The story of Jason reminds us that no matter how dark things seem, change is always within reach if we're willing to work for it. Never underestimate the power of persistence, and remember, it's never too late to take that first step toward a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this journey of hope, growth, and transformation, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories. Together, we can all take steps toward a better future. See you in the next story.